Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and how to build a great team. My goal is to bring you cutting-edge ideas and resources that you can begin using right away in your leadership practice. And so you don't miss any of these valuable episodes, please subscribe. Yes, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now if you haven't already done so. Another reason I do the podcast is so that you can get to know me, the kinds of ideas I stand for, and some of the people I stand with or who stand with me. I am also an active consultant with organizations, and I coach a number of leaders who are working on their relational skills as they lead. So if you'd like to talk to me about how I might be able to help your organization, your team, or maybe help you on an individual level, please feel free to email me at mike@drmikepatterson.com. Today, we're going to focus on a really important topic, kind of in a new way, a different way, at least from the perspective of language and how we talk about it. But I'm really excited for you to meet my guest, Ray Linder. Ray is a longtime friend, and I call him a modern day Renaissance man because he has a wide array of interests and accomplishments. We have traveled and worked together for clients, with clients on a number of projects over the years. And I'm always surprised at just what Ray is into. He's into music. He's into wine. He's into poker. And most importantly, he's into leadership and talent development and bringing out the best in people like I am. Officially, Ray Linder helps government agencies, Fortune 100 companies, and major universities develop leaders, strengthen teamwork, and navigate change. He has taught thousands. And a few years ago, he used to say 10,000. I think that's probably much higher than that now. He's taught those individuals how to be themselves with more skill. He's done this at places like Harvard Business School, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the Office of Personnel Management, and the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as Johns Hopkins University, and the list goes on and on and on. Ray is the author of 3 books, one of which is about personal finance and personality type, where he was able to combine his interest in psychology and psychometric assessments with his formal education in finance and economics. As a result, he was featured on CNBC. There've been articles about him in USA Today, the Boston Herald, the Washington Post, and Men's Health magazine. He's been everywhere. He's associated with several firms that focus on talent development and has served as an adjunct faculty member at the federal executive. Ray Linder, all the way from the Washington, D.C. metro area, or as the cool people there like to say, the DMV, welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. I'm glad you're here, my friend.
It is so good to hear your voice, Mike, and I'm so happy to be doing this with you today.
Well, it's sure good to be with you, Ray. We've been on the road a lot together and always enjoyed ourselves and did good work. So now we get to share what we think about a very important topic with my audience. So our topic today is how to inclusion. Now, that's a different way than we tend to describe inclusion. In fact, this whole area of diversity, equity, and inclusion is an important and active and ever-present conversation in the workplace these days. But you're going to talk us through this idea of inclusioning in a little different way. In fact, just the way you talk about it is different. Why do you refer to inclusion in this way?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I have given a lot of thought to this kind of question about how do organizations achieve inclusion as part of their DEI initiatives. And I like to even start from the place of why do we bother with it at all? Whether we call it inclusion, or I use my words inclusioning or to inclusion, the point is ultimately creating a place where everybody feels like they belong. That's the goal, creating a place where everybody feels like they belong. And this isn't a state that gets achieved. This is something that happens in each and every interaction. Because if you think about it from the organizational life standpoint, Mike, people come, people go, new people come in. Those are new relationships. I get promoted, I get assigned to a new role, I'm interacting with different people. Those are new relationships. The business grows, they've got more clients, they've got more partners. Those are new relationships. All those relationships have to then create a sense of belonging. And therefore, belonging is something that's active. It's something that happens like in each and every interaction. And so that's why I like to turn the whole thing into a verb, to not be something that is like an end state. We've achieved inclusion like a noun, because a noun I can see it, it's there, or it's not there. Quick example. You have a podcast. I don't have a podcast. Podcast is a noun. I've just described two states of the world. But if I tell somebody that Mike and I are podcasting, that creates a whole different mental framework about that invokes people actually doing something. So when I'm working with leaders, when I'm talking to organizations, when I'm giving keynotes on this subject, yes, my keynote is called How to Inclusion. And I encourage people to use the verb inclusioning so that they're constantly thinking about an activity that they have to do in each and every interaction that ultimately creates a place where everybody feels like they belong.
I love that, Ray. I love that idea. The fame, and I don't know who said it, you might, but there's a famous metaphor that's often given to describe what inclusion is, and it brings in the idea of diversity. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being invited to dance, to be in the action, in the mix, to have a seat at the table, to have a voice in decision making, to fully participate in the life of the organization. And the life of the organization is really how people engage with one another. So I think you've nailed it with that initial description. But if I'm a business person listening to the podcast, maybe I'm a small business person, a middle level manager, and I'm thinking, yeah, I know we talk about DE&I initiatives, and I think it's important, but are there hard numbers? Is there a business case for inclusioning?
Yeah, Mike, and if I can start just from the metaphor that you had used. So if I keep asking someone to dance, what are they ultimately going to get really good at? They're going to get good at dancing, right? And so the idea, if we keep inclusioning, there is actually hard quantitative business evidence for the benefits of inclusioning. So teams or organizations that are actively inclusioning make better decisions. They are more flexible, creative, and innovative. And here's something really interesting. If you think from a typical business perspective, creative and innovative projects are generally deemed the ones with the highest risk. And so we try to mitigate that risk with alternative financial plans, with alternative staffing plans, with different schedules. And, there's a plan B, C, D, and E, and so forth. But quantitatively, research shows that organizations that are more inclusioning are more innovative with less risk. So there is risk mitigation just from the standpoint of this inclusioning activity that brings everybody to the dance, if you will. They also generate higher revenues from new products and services. Again, another example of usually projects that are deemed the most risky actually have better financial returns when those products and services are developed by highly inclusion teams. And finally, people love to work at organizations like that. And so these kind of organizations that are adept at inclusioning attract a wider range of talent, which then again does what? Ensures that they have greater flexibility, greater creativity, greater innovation, better decision-making, because they're drawing from a more agile and more adept talent pool.
Tell me a little more, Ray, about the aspect of risk reduction that comes with more inclusive teams. How does that work exactly?
Yeah, because one of the biggest elements where we find, one of the biggest things that we have to guard against in terms of risk is what don't we know? What have we missed? What are our blind spots? And the risk actually comes from something that actually happened that we hadn't planned for, again, because we didn't have information. We had particular blind spots. And the idea is when you've got a diverse and that diverse group of people are allowed to be themselves and bring all of their creativity and all these ideas, it does reduce the likelihood that we haven't thought of anything. It does reduce the likelihood that we have a blind spot. Blind spots come from thinking the same old ways or everybody thinking together. But when we've got diverse voices that feel like they can share what's on their mind and share their ideas, it does reduce the likelihood that we've got blind spots, tunnel vision, groupthink. And so all those sort of ways in which we miss information that we would have wanted to guard against, it goes lower when we've got more seats at the table, more people are dancing with their ideas.
So this idea of diversity is often I often think about, and maybe others think about diversity as diversity in the way that people look. You and I look different, but the way you just described inclusion and having diverse viewpoints and overcoming potential blind spots seem to be about more about how people think and approach situations and how they see things through their eyes. Is that about how people look or about how people think?
It's about how people are. And so that encompasses, how we perceive people based on how they look. But that's just so surface level. And you're indicating something really, really important, that if people can be how they are, then they're bringing all of their knowledge, whether learned from a variety of different universities and training programs and et cetera. They bring their knowledge from years of experience. They bring their knowledge from people that they interact with. So they're bringing their full presence. And now we've got a number of different presences, if you will, people just representing a wide range. And you say of thought, yes, a wide range of thought, a wide range of ideas, a wide range of experiences. And again, with belonging, with inclusioning, they are in an environment where they can bring all of that to the table.
It seems like to be all that you are authentically requires a lot of safety. And I would think safety is the prime, or a lack of safety is the primary barrier to inclusioning. Am I right about that? How does psychological safety fit into this conversation?
It clearly does. And so here's where it is. I think of psychological safety as a really useful term. But sometimes, again, how do I make it actionable? And so I like to have people not so much think about the term psychological safety, but what is the evidence in the workplace that there is psychological safety? And so I've got a number of things that you can look around and determine, do people feel safe or not? So when people feel safe, they have a higher degree of commitment. Because if I feel safe with you, then now we have a common bond. We share common goals. We're dedicated to the same things. We're loyal to the same things. And I'm going to demonstrate higher commitment to you, Mike, when I feel a sense of belonging with you, that deep sense of connection. That also allows me to anticipate what you're thinking and maybe what you need faster in a case where I'm in a situation where I feel a greater sense of belonging. I'm more likely to ask you to meet my needs if I feel like we've got this great sense of belonging. Just general positivity, adjectives like joy, like pleasure, happiness. When you see that on a team, when you see that in a workplace, those are indicators of high degree of psychological safety. And oh, by the way, those adjectives that I just mentioned, which are sort of emotional adjectives, joy or enjoyment, pleasure, happiness. We also know psychologically, that's where the greatest amount of creativity and innovation come from, which ties back to teams and organizations that have that degree of creativity and innovation are able to succeed in projects with less risk, not just the financial risk, but psychological risk. So all these things are connected. And so when I do go back into thinking, how you got us into this question of psychological safety. I like people just think, what are the markers of that? So things like I said, commitment is a marker of that. Anticipation of everybody's needs within the team and willing to ask for things that they need are indications of psychological safety. And just those emotional feelings of a joy to be around, pleasure, if things are pleasurable, they make people happy. All these things are indicators of psychological safety.
So look for the fruit. If it is a safe environment, there will be fruit as evidence of that safety. Because you've probably been with me, Ray, when I've asked the question to an audience: is it safe to disagree with you if you're the manager? And everyone in the room raises their hand and says, yes, of course, it's safe to disagree with me. And then my follow-up question is always, would you say the same is true for every manager in the organization? And of course, everyone disagree. I mean, they don't agree that that's true for everyone in the organization. So there's a disconnect there. You're kind of overcoming people's self-perception of whether they're creating a safe environment and looking for the fruit or the outcomes of that environment. So I appreciate that. Now, we often talk about on this show the importance of a healthy organizational culture. So how does inclusioning, the verb, impact a team or organizational culture?
Yeah, so similar to the idea of psychological safety. So when the act of inclusioning, when you give me a sense that my presence matters, which means, like I said, in totality, my ideas matter, my experience matters, my way of thinking on this subject matters, and I feel that I've been given a reasonable hearing. And to your earlier point, maybe I disagreed with you in that process. Well, to the degree that you're not put off by the fact that I'm coming at this from a different standpoint, by the fact that I feel safe enough with you to share a completely different view about a common problem, gives me, as I said a minute ago, a greater sense of shared commitment, not only to the problem you and I are trying to solve, but a greater sense of trying to solve this problem with you in particular, Mike. So that's fruit of a sense of commitment, inclusioning, the act of inclusioning are like the currency of commitment. The act of inclusioning is the currency of positive emotion. So you ask the question, do I feel like I disagree with my manager? And I say, yes, I do feel that way. All right. So is my enjoyment from working with my manager decrease if I disagree with you? Is my pleasure of having this conversation where I'm disagreeing with you, is that decrease? Do I walk away happy after having this conversation that I disagreed with you, Mike? Inclusioning makes those feelings that I just described higher than if I don't have inclusioning, I don't have that sense of belonging, then I do have a sense of some degree of trepidation. Even if I do say, I raise my hand, yes, I can disagree with you, but any little degree of trepidation in that indicates I don't have the same degree of the highest degree of belonging, which means that there's still some inclusioning work to be done.
I'm really into the positive aspects of inclusioning, but what's the downside to not creating an inclusive environment for the people in your organization, the folks on your team? What's at risk? What's at stake when we don't welcome people and or have people feel welcome and comfortable with those diverse perspectives in the room? What do we lose?
I would bet everybody that's hearing this podcast, Mike, can probably see what they lose in a very, very common scorecard, so common that most organizations use them every year. And it's something called an engagement survey, an employee engagement survey. And you will see the degree of your inclusioning efforts show up with hard numbers. Is our employee engagement going up? Is our employee engagement going down? And many of those questions that are in common in engagement surveys do deal directly or even indirectly with what I call inclusioning type behaviors, that to the degree that people don't feel that sense of belonging, means that they are likely to reflect that lack of belonging somewhere in an employee engagement survey.
So, Ray, all this sounds good. I mean, you've sold me. You've sold our listeners on the importance of creating that inclusive culture. But how do you do it? Is it hard to do? What are some actionable steps that leaders need to take to inclusion, to do inclusioning? Give us something that's actionable.
Yeah, so let's take that as a two-part question, if we could, because I did hear sort of two different things. You want to know, is it hard? And so what do we do about it? The answer is yes. The answer to your first question is yes, it's hard. And it's an interesting paradox that most organizations, just like as you said, they're sold on this idea. I mean, who doesn't have some sort of DEI kind of initiative? And it's not even really new. Organizations have been doing this work for some time, and they're continuing to grow and innovate and be creative in this work. But it's still hard. And we do know from studies that most organizations, while they are trying, are still dissatisfied with their DEI efforts. And usually I would point to that the idea of not being inclusioning enough. And so let me talk about why it's hard. And here's the irony. Who among us doesn't want a sense of belonging? It's part of human nature. And yet there's an actual psychological thing that happens with us, and it's been proven in neuroscience, that belonging, that sense of belonging, our human nature works against the fact, the challenge of honoring differences. And here's a fancy psychological word, and I'll break it down and make it fairly easy. There's something that psychologists call a false consensus bias or a false consensus effect. When I say the word bias, people immediately think of really, really negative things. So let me sort of emotionally unpack that. Literally, all bias means is leaning one way or another. So that's a bias to the left or a bias to the right, a bias to, think of a seesaw. One side's biased up, one side is biased down. In other words, there's no sort of negative connotation of something having a bias. It's just an initial leaning. And so the way that we're wired, interestingly enough, as human beings, is to want to get along with other people. And therefore, we're sort of biased to thinking that other people are like us. And what this bias causes us to do is overestimate the degree to which we think other people are like us. That's our initial assumption. This is what causes us to have small talk waiting online in the grocery store or something like that. We estimate that people are like us, but the bias is that we tend to overestimate that. So here's the cost of that. The good news is this is how we create a sense of belonging. The bad news is when people respond like we think they should respond to us, that's not noteworthy because our bias is already to, well, Mike's like me. And when I'm interacting with Mike, when you do something I would do, Mike, I don't really think about that. And when the stakes are high, especially that you're thinking like me, I go, wow, this guy and I are a lot alike. I like that. But here's the downside of the bias. When you don't act like me, when you don't share my suggestion, when you say or do something different, we perceive that as uncommon and we distort our view of the other person. So act like me, that's normal. Don't act like me, you're weird, you're wrong, it's your fault. And so we start with this idea that belonging, we want belonging. We're wired to want belonging and behave in that way. But the minute we see a difference, we perceive that difference in a highly negative way, which is why I come back to my whole idea of let's turn this into a verb so that we can actively work against the thing that would prevent us from achieving this high sense of belonging, these active things that we're constantly doing to achieve inclusioning. And I do have two tools to help us do that, if that made sense to you, Mike.
Yeah, I'm with you on that false consensus bias. We tend to see people as we are, not as they are. So that's helpful. I'm still looking for some practical tools though, Ray. Give us something we can work with here. How do we do it?
Yeah, so here's the how to do it. The tools for inclusioning, there's two of them, and I'll unpack them. So let me say what they are, and then we'll take each one at a time here. The first is empathy, but you'll hear me, and I love to change my words around to get people to think about these things more deeply. So I like to call it empathic capacity. So empathy, or what I call empathic capacity, I'll break that down in a minute. That's tool number one. Tool number two is curiosity. So empathy or empathic capacity and curiosity are the two primary tools of inclusioning. And if you do these actively, early, and often, you are well on your way of inclusioning and then creating that sense of that place where people feel like they belong. Let's take empathy first, empathic capacity. And here's some more data for you if you're still on the fence about that. 93% of employees say they are more likely to stay with an employer if they consider that employer empathetic. I'll just say that again, because that's a shockingly high number, an amazingly high number. 93% of employees are more likely to stay with an organization if they consider that employer to be empathetic.
Ray, but let me stop you there. Define the term empathetic.
Yes. So, and I'm going to call it empathic capacity. And I'm drawing on the work of a really good book that opened my mind up and totally allowed me to reframe empathy. And the book is actually called The Empathy Effect. And I'm guessing most of your listeners out there were probably like me, and there I am demonstrating a false census effect, right? Saying that everybody must feel like me. But I used to hear that word empathy, and I thought immediately of feelings and trying to understand someone else's feelings. And therefore, I tended to think of empathy as something that some people had because they were naturally feeling type people and have personality traits that demonstrate care and concern for other people. And other people aren't necessarily wired as much that way and feeling like, yeah, it's something like some people have and some people don't have. But what I learned from Helen Reese, the author of this book, Empathy Effect, that empathic capacity, so just by saying empathic capacity indicates that this is something that you can grow in, that if you have a low capacity, you can increase that capacity. And that capacity is made up not only of feeling elements, but of thinking or logical elements that then get translated into action. And this really spoke to me because it said, yes, there is a feeling component. And that's the first thing that you would do. So to have empathic capacity, the first thing that you need to do is perceive what others are feeling, not make a judgment about it, not decide that you would be doing something different in that particular circumstance, but merely observe and perceive what you believe others are feeling. Then secondly, the logic processing part comes in, process that information and with the goal of coming to the conclusion that based on what I'm perceiving and hearing them telling me about how they're experiencing this moment or whatever, how they're feeling or thinking about it actually makes sense. It makes sense to them. I might do something different. I might be saying something different, but their response is reasonable and logical to them. And therefore now the third part, take action. So how should I respond to someone who is feeling a certain way and I understand their reasoning behind their feeling that way? Now, what's an appropriate response from there? I'm hoping that helps other people as much as that helped me, because it helped me realize, one, I don't really have to put myself in their shoes, which is commonly what empathy is described as. I just need to sit and listen and observe and hear what someone is doing or saying, and then try to understand from their perspective why they're feeling or doing that thing. And then I can act in response to that. Now, before I get to the second step, which actually helps enable that first step, imagine what it would feel like or how that would create a sense of belonging if someone sat and listened to me or observed me, was able to articulate what they perceived me to be doing. Therefore, I feel seen, I feel heard, and then took action on what I was experiencing, not them solving my problem in their way. Does that make sense, Mike? How would you feel if someone responded to you in that fashion by observing you, hearing you, feeling you, making sense out of what you're saying, and taking action that resonated with you?
Yeah, I would feel valued. I'd feel appreciated. understood, all those things that people want and need from their leaders. Ray, let me dive in a little deeper and get you to answer this follow-up question.
Sure.
Does that empathic capacity stuff demand that I see other people with through this lens of positive intent? Do I need to recognize that people want to do the right thing, or they're doing the right thing in their eyes? How does positive intention work with empathic capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of and interestingly enough, Mike, that's the process part. Remember I said, so empathic capacity has three parts: first feel, then process, then act. Part of the processing starts with a principle or a framework that you said of this person has positive intent. This idea that they're sharing may be flawed. Their lack of experience may be causing them to act or respond to this situation in a way that, through my filter, I would say, well, it's not helpful. And I could call that inappropriate. I could call that flawed. I could call that naive. I could label it a whole bunch of things. But my goal is to understand they have reasons behind what they're doing or saying. And Mike, you and I have worked together a long time, and I'm fond of saying, asking the question, why would a reasonable, rational, decent human being do or think what they're saying right now? And in that, I am starting from that positive intent. This person is reasonable. They are rational. They're a decent person. Therefore, there is something good that they are trying to accomplish right now. And my job in empathic capacity is to try to figure that out.
And I think that takes us, maybe that's the bridge to the other aspect that you're going to share with us, and that's the curiosity piece.
Absolutely, and that's sort of the engine, the gasoline of empathic capacity. It fuels empathic capacity. My willingness to be curious, to hear you. Let me give you another stat on this one too. Employees who feel heard are approximately 5 times more likely to say they feel empowered to do their best work. Employees who feel heard are approximately 5 times more likely to say they feel empowered to do their best work. And so my willingness, it's not even an ability, it's just my willingness to turn on, let me be curious. Let me really sit and listen, not just hear the words, but observe the body language. Let me pick up things from their tone of voice. Let me see and observe the shifts in their energy as they're telling me or doing certain things. And when I'm not sure about something, let me ask questions about, tell me more about that. What else were you thinking about when you did or said or something like that? Is there anything else you'd like to add? And let me continue to invite you, back to your earlier metaphor, let me continue to invite you to dance in this conversation. Let me not lead you in a certain direction. Let me not assume that I already know something. Let me not jump to problem solve. Let me keep asking and listening with a very curious mindset so I can fully get enough information to process your feelings, your suggestions, your ideas in a way that I can shape. Like I said, the ultimate goal is shaping a response that makes you feel heard, that makes you feel valued, that makes you feel empowered to continue to think and say and do things, even if I may end up correcting or coaching you. Now you still feel empowered. That conversation with Ray was great. It makes me feel safe that I can have similar conversations in the future without feeling dumb or stupid or inexperienced or wrong or any of these things. So curiosity, as you led me to, is super, super, super important. And you cannot have empathic capacity without a sense of curiosity.
If I could ascribe a physical state or body position to the word curiosity, I always think of someone who's leaning in.
Absolutely.
Who's leaning in toward that other person to see them more clearly, to understand them more deeply, to hear them more clearly. All those things come with curiosity. And when we are leaning toward another person, it seems to me that it makes that other person, in most situations, feel welcome, feel warmer, feel more connected with us, because instead of the Heisman stiff arm. We're actually leaning in to embrace them and their ideas.
Yeah, remember the goal of inclusioning is a sense of belonging, and belonging implies nearness. It implies some sort of closeness. Doesn't have to be even physical proximity, but we all know the feeling of closeness, whether it's on a Zoom call, a phone call, a text, or we're sitting in a room together. We all know what that feeling of belonging feels like. And the goal of inclusioning is to create that sense of belonging. And curiosity is the pathway toward that activity of inclusioning.
I love this, Ray. You've summarized this topic incredibly well for us. You mentioned a book earlier. Are there other resources that you might recommend for those who want to learn more about this topic? And I'm going to put those, if you give us any ideas here, I'm going to put those links in the show notes. Where are you grounding these ideas? What books are you reading?
Yeah, two that immediately come to my mind, Mike, and I mentioned one. One is called The Empathy Effect by Helen Rees, Riess. Helen Rees, Empathy Effect, really, really good book. And like I said, just tremendously helped me unpack this false notion that empathy is all about feeling, and help correct that, because it's not only about feeling, which, like I said, can be demonstrated through a sense of curiosity. I don't even have to be a feeling personality is kind of the point. I just need to be a person who's willing to listen, can connote a sense of feeling. And then my sense of logic in terms of process, and action. She also has a great mnemonic device that each letter of empathy stands for something different. And so I'll just put that out as a teaser to recommend everybody get that book. And particularly look for the empathy mnemonic, the 7 different steps that demonstrate empathic capacity. So that's one book. The other book is about asking really great questions. It's a book called Humble Inquiry by Edgar Schein, who is well known for his books on leadership and particularly around culture. This book is really, really excellent, just about the idea of curiosity, and listening and inquiring from a place that does create, the whole title, Humble Inquiry. It's the idea that I don't know, but I'm going to ask questions so I can learn. And in that process, we create, and he doesn't use the word inclusion, that's mine, but it is a pathway toward inclusioning. Ultimately, it creates psychological safety and connection through knowing how to ask the right questions in humble ways.
And isn't Edgar Schein the guy who described culture very simply as the way we treat people around here, the way we do things around here? And I think your point, Ray, is if we treat people with empathy, we use curiosity, we practice inclusioning, we create the kind of culture where people are going to be engaged, enthusiastic, encouraged, enabled to do their best work. And I think that's what the kind of team we all want.
Yeah, who doesn't want to be on that kind of team? And you think of, any of us can think of when we've been on teams that did generate those feelings of enjoyment and pleasure and happiness and understanding. I think of sports teams that I've been on, or I used to play a lot of tennis. My doubles partner and I, we had that sense of mutual commitment. We had that sense of joy of playing together. We had that sense of anticipation, for each other and where each other was going to be. Those things can happen on any kind of team to generate high performance. Totally agreed, Mike.
Ray, for those who have been listening to the podcast, they know that I always conclude every interview with this request. And it's the request that you, my guests, give my listeners something they can begin doing right away that will help them lead better and create that kind of team that we've been talking about today. So give us one practical thing that people can start doing this afternoon, tomorrow morning. Put these ideas to work for us very simply.
The first, yes, very, very simple. I'm going to, you have a 1A and maybe a 1 and a 1A. In your next conversation, commit to listening. In your next conversation, just commit to really deep, empathic, curious listening. And when you feel the temptation to talk, and I just learned this acronym recently, The acronym is WAIT, which stands for Why Am I Talking? Resist that temptation. So just wait. So you don't have to correct yourself from talking. Just listen with deep curiosity. It's the very next thing I would ask people to do.
I love that. Wait. Something I should practice more often. So, time flies when you're having a great conversation. And Ray, this has truly been a great and informative conversation. I'm so happy that you were my guest today. I want to have you back. We've already talked about another topic that you would be great at addressing for us, but that's for another time. So, Ray, thank you for being such a great guest. How can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about your work, maybe bring you in to speak or work with their organization?
Yeah, easiest place is my website, raylinder.net. You can look me up on LinkedIn under Ray Linder, or shoot me an email at ray@goodstewardship.com. So those are the easiest places. And, a personality guru on Twitter. I'm sure you'll put all this on in the show notes there somewhere, but there are several locations where you can find me.
Indeed. I will put all those links in the show notes. Friends, thank you for listening to this episode of the Mission First People Always podcast. Please join us next time for another interesting conversation about the things that can help you become a great leader and builder of great teams. And in the meantime, if you haven't read my book, Mission First People Always, The Definitive Guide to Balancing People and Performance, I'd encourage you to get a hold of it right away. It's not very expensive. Get a copy for your spouse, get a copy for your boss, get a copy for your friend, get a copy for your enemy. It's that good because I provide 9 practices that will help you lead better and build better teams. And I think the things I talk about in the book are very aligned with the things that Ray shared with us today. So that's it, folks. Subscribe to the podcast. Come back and talk to us again soon. To all of you, may God bless you richly as you work to become a better leader and builder of better teams. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.